Hello, folks. I think I might be live, but I'm not 100% certain. I've changed some settings in my OBS, and I don't know if I'm live. Not entirely sure what I've done. I've changed a load of things in order to try and do some live streaming through a different platform other than YouTube. It didn't go awfully well, so I'm trying this again back on YouTube. Let's give it another go. Fingers crossed I'm coming through. Let me know if you can hear me. Thank you, Stony. Fantastic. Thank you, Aztec. That is good. Woo, right. So it had been okay. So let's start properly. I need to still see if I can find a proper chat function through my stream. I don't know what I've done there. Absolutely ridiculous. All sorts of stuff. Richard, thank you. Hello, nice to see you. And nice to see you as well, Anvil. I think you were in the chat slightly earlier. Thank you for that. Lewis, hello. Hello. So, do we think? Bear with me whilst I go through some of my technical challenges that I've caused for myself. Such as I seem to have completely deleted the chat window. So I can see you through YouTube. I can actually see on the sort of live feed through YouTube. I can see that there is chat. I can see you. Hispazagan, hello. Glad I'm coming through nice and clear. I just can't get my my regular. You know what? That'll be a problem for another day. Let's just. I'm going to go with my sort of Heath Robinson sort of approach to this. I've got all kinds of bits of tech going all over the place. So we're just gonna get into this. So this one is a live stream. It's also a GW book club. So if you're not familiar with my GW book club, this is where normally I and my good friend Stu from the Miniature Realms YouTube channel, we basically go back and we read classic Games Workshop fiction. We also read armies books and codex books and all that kind of stuff, and then we just have a chat about them. So because we've got big plans for this year, we're doing lots of other stuff. We're doing some non-Games Workshop books, so we're going to be getting into things like Starship Troopers and Dune and Lord of the Rings. So that's all stuff that's coming up for the sort of more traditional GW book club videos. So you'll see those conversations come out as podcasts as usual. But I've been getting really antsy and over eager about going back and finishing the original run of Games Workshop books. So we did all 17 of the GW books that were published in the late 80s, early 90s. Fantastic reads, a lot of them very interesting, some very cool ideas. Not every book is a classic, I think it's probably fair to say, but some really cool stuff, and I did enjoy that a lot. So I was really keen to finish off the actual original run of books. So for anybody who's not familiar with the actual publishing history, GW Books was created as an imprint by Games Workshop in like 1988. They published books through 89, 90, and 91, including classics like Drachenfels and Inquisitor by Ian Watson, the Conrad trilogy, those kinds of things. And then when the management buyout took place in Games Workshop, the book line was ended. It was surplus to requirements. It wasn't where the money needed to be spent. So they got rid of that, basically cancelled off anything that was being written or planned. Some stuff had been written but hadn't been released yet. That's where Boxtree then stepped in. So a subsidiary and imprint of Pan Macmillan, in around 1993, they started publishing what was left of those original Games Workshop books that hadn't actually been printed. They republished a lot of the old books that had come out, and then they added a load more books to the run, including the end of Ian Watson's Inquisitor trilogy, There was an extra Dark Future book, which was an expansion of a short story by Kim Newman, writing as Jack Yeovil. And then we get Space Marine as well by Ian Watson. So I've been really eager to read the sort of remaining books from that era that I haven't read. So I've never read this book before. And until I'd read Inquisitor, I'd never read any Ian Watson books at all. So that was quite an exciting ride. Really enjoyed that. But yeah, Space Marine, been very tempted to read this many times. But now it kind of felt like, okay, let's get it done. Let's get into it. So it was time. It was time to get started. So we're going to be chatting about this book. What an interesting book it is. There's a lot of, I don't know what the word would be. I don't know if hype is the right word for this book. There is a lot of chatter online. There's a lot of stuff online about Space Marine generally, and about the writing that's in here, and about how wild it is and how unusual and, nuts, I think, is a term that was used, and all sorts of stuff. So there's quite a lot of expectation going into this, but also I know that this is of an earlier era of 40k. So this is before things really settled into what we would recognise today as 40k. There's a lot of change that needs to happen from, the Rogue Trader years to a sort of a more recognisable current 40k. It would change many, many times. There's huge shifts and changes. But this particular book is from a time when a lot of stuff was up for grabs, right? So there's the opportunity to kind of, Ian Watson was creating brand new stuff. Just coming up with ideas, taking a look at pieces of art, obviously taking direction from GW, from Brian Ansell, from Rick Priestley, drawing on published material, but also there seems to have been a lot of leeway to just create wild stuff. And he's telling a story. He's trying to make Space Marines interesting. There isn't loads of fiction about Space Marines when this book comes out. There is, stuff in Rogue Trader. There's stuff in White Dwarf. We know what a Space Marine is, and we know broadly how they're made and that kind of thing. But Space Marine characters are still sort of taking shape. A lot of that lore doesn't exist in the deep backstory, the chapters, and the Horus Heresy, and a lot of other stuff around the Emperor and all sorts. So this book is a really interesting opportunity to sort of see a proto-40k, a time before it would really become 40k. So it's not quite Rogue Trader either, I would say, but it's not 40k yet too. So it kind of sits in this unusual sort of space on its own. I know in more recent times the book has been republished by Black Library, and I think that they gave it a kind of I don't think they called it a tale of heresy, but I think they were like, it's a heretical text. This is an untrustworthy document. I think they did that for the Inquisitor trilogy, certainly, but they also republished Space Marine as well, and kind of said, this is not current canon, but it is a classic. It is part of history. So that was, I'm aware of all of this going in. So sitting down to read Space Marine has been quite an exciting thing to do for me, I suppose, to just try and, get my head around what wonderful stuff Ian Watson had in mind. And it is wild, and there is some wonderful stuff here. I did overall really enjoy this book. I think it was a good, compelling read. I also think there's a lot of stuff that was kind of almost left on the table, when it comes to the actual sort of, like, how much things are explored. It's quite, in some ways, it's quite fast-paced. So you jump through a series of, like, really big wars and big action scenes and stuff without really, I guess, dwelling on them all that much. But then there's also times when it's quite slow. So there's quite an interesting pacing kind of conundrum within this book. But I will start from the start. So for anybody who hasn't read Space Marine, essentially it's quite a simple story. It is 3 raw recruits from Necromundan gangs are brought in to be Space Marines. They're recruited in to be Space Marines. I think they're around 13, 14, maybe 15 years old. They are from different levels of society in the hives on Necromunda. So they're within the Trazior hive. There is a sort of an upper class kind of I guess you would. I suppose he's sort of Bullingdon Club kind of sort of fancy Dan kind of guy who's out just. They're rich and they don't care about anything. Then there is the sort of mid-level tech gangs, and then there is a guy from the sort of underhive as well. And the three of them have an altercation. There's kind of a bit of a gang war. The three of them end up fighting in the underhive, and then they end up, for their own reasons, joining up or going to a recruitment drive to see if they can become Imperial Fists. So there is, and then basically the story is just these three recruits getting through their training, becoming scouts, going on a scout mission, becoming true Space Marines, and then doing some Space Marine stuff. And that's basically, the broad strokes of the novel. We get to see a sort of planetary civil war. We get to see a bit of chaos, and we get to see Tyranids. And yeah, you learn a lot about an earlier version of the Imperial Fists and just Space Marines and how they work and think. The book itself actually starts, and I love this, so the Warhammer Fantasy books all start with a timeline, which is really big. So there's like 3 or 4 pages of stuff, of information, possibly even more for the Warhammer Fantasy books, because it takes into account all of the other books. The majority of those original GW books and Box Tree, well, not the Box Tree books so much, but the majority of the GW books were Warhammer Fantasy. So there's this huge timeline for that. In the 40k books, because there's only Inquisitor and a collection of short stories for the Deathwing anthology, we get a timeline for the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it's 2 pages long. So it's 40,000 years worth of history in 2 pages. We do get a bit about the Dark Age of technology, we get something about the Age of Strife, and we get something about the Horus Heresy. So it really skips through the history of 40k, and then you get to the Age of the Imperium as well. So it sets the scene, and it gives you the sense of scale of the 41st millennium. Now, I don't know who wrote the timeline. I don't know if it was Ian Watson or more likely was one of the editors. But it gives you, like the sort of Dune-esque nature of the 40k universe, it gives you the scope and scale of deep history and enormous empires and, a massive gulf of time and history. And we're jumping in to the present day in the 41st millennium. And then we start with Necromunda. And I thought this was really good. So I really, really enjoyed getting just a few glimpses of life on Necromunda. So this would not be the first time Necromunda appears. There is mention of Necromunda in White Dwarf when they're talking about hive cities. There is then Confrontation, which was the sort of proto-Necromunda game, so a skirmish game set on the planet of Necromunda. So there's already quite a lot of information about Necromunda and how it works. But in this book, it's a book, it's a story. So we're seeing characters in that world. It's not just lore, it's actually stuff that's happening and taking place. And we're seeing characters interact with that world, and a bit about the social strata and all of this kind of stuff. How these things function, how gang wars take place, the nature of those gangs, and why they're different and how they're different. I mean, there's some horrendous stuff where the sort of fancy dance, one of our main characters, Lexandro, is a member of the Lordly Phantasms. This is the sort of, a bunch of rich kids, basically, whose parents are quite high up in the nobility or the hierarchy of their particular spire, and they just go out and make a mess of stuff. And they end up capturing some guys from these 2 other gangs, the 2 lower status gangs, and then just throwing them into a sort of engineering chute, a sort of tunnel, a vent or something like that, and it just sort of burns them alive. And they do it just because they can. It's one of these shafts that goes right down to the bottom of the hive, and they're like, oh, if we throw someone down there, it's almost like throwing a stone into a well. We'll see how deep it is. But because it's also this kind of evacuation tunnel for all of this hot air, it just burns them. And so it's horrendous. And they're just like, yeah, fine. There's no mercy. There's no compassion in this hive. Everyone's kind of out for themselves, except for your gang. And that was, I think, it is kind of the shocking sort of world, that same brutal world that we would see in Necromunda later on. But it's really cool to see these characters interacting and running around, and we're getting a bit of life on the planet. So I liked that very much. It's not a long section, but it's really, really good. It's a strong start for me. And we get introduced to Alexandro Arquebus and Biff Tundrish and Jeremy Valance. So these are the three different characters who will be following through as they become Imperial Fists. Nathan, you were asking different universe fantasy, but have I read Sword of Justice and or Sword of Vengeance? I have not actually read those. No, I there's a lot of fantasy novels that I'm also working my way through. But yeah, I've got a long list. I don't know that I've got either on the shelf. I may have copies, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I'm very eager to read, but I'm not a particularly fast reader, and I got out of the habit a couple of years ago. I used to read a lot more. I used to spend a lot more time reading, and I kind of got out of the habit a couple of years ago. And it's over the last couple of over since starting the book club, essentially, I've been retraining those muscles and trying to read more and more and more. And I am reading a lot these days again, which is great, but I'm not reading anywhere near as quickly as I used to, and I was never that quick. So it's something I want to do more and more of. Richard, yes, confrontation articles, which really got the juices flowing for Necromunda. All the Imperium expansion after that, beyond the army, basically. And this was part of that expansion. Really transformative stuff. Absolutely, right? Yeah, I mean, the confrontation stuff, and a lot of what you would see in White Dwarf between Rogue Trader and 2nd edition, there's some really incredible stuff. I mean, we will get to it soon enough, but there's things taken whole cloth from like Rick Priestley's background writing in White Dwarf that have found their way into here, particularly around the sort of the physical creation of Space Marines. So how they work, how they're created, the actual organs that they have inside them, all of the steps that go into building this perfect genetically modified warrior. And that's all fantastic. But getting the chance to just see them like on a ship, not fighting battles, but just like hanging out together, interacting with one another. And that's true of both when they're in the gangs, but also when they become scouts, when they become recruits, and then Space Marines. All of that stuff is the kind of stuff you don't get to see in a codex. You don't get to see it on the battlefield. You get to see those quiet moments and those character-driven moments in novels like this. So I can imagine, at the time, 1993, I started in 94, 95. So this is just before my time. But I can absolutely imagine that this coming out and giving you a glimpse into those worlds must have been pretty cool, right? I mean, was anyone in the chat, is anyone that actually like remember Space Marine coming out and going on shelves, and like the reactions to it in the stores and amongst you and your friends as hobbyists? I imagine it must have been pretty cool, right? It's giving you something very different, even if you don't like the novel. And I can understand why this book is not for everybody. But even if you don't like it, getting access to this kind of stuff through these lenses, I think is really, really cool. Like the books, having the insight into the world beyond just here's the army and here's how they fight other armies. For me, that kind of brings a lot to life. Warhammer Fantasy, because it had fantasy roleplay, has always had additional lenses looking at its world, and that's really cool. That's like a really interesting extra way into that universe, so you can explore it in different ways beyond the wargaming tabletop. And it's always been an interesting one that it took so long for 40k to get its role-playing game, but that meant that you didn't get that lens, you didn't get that sort of gateway into it, which I think is just fascinating. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Christopher, not right on release, but I read it within a couple of years of it coming out. And John bought it at the time, enjoyed it much more than the Inquisitor series. That's interesting. I mean, I've not finished the Inquisitor series. For me, the first Inquisitor book, whilst it has its own quirks and challenges, I really enjoyed it overall. I think there was some stuff that was kind of like, I'm not too sure about this. But as a book, generally, I found myself quite enjoying Inquisitor, quite looking forward to the next book in the series. For Space Marine, whilst I enjoyed it, I didn't enjoy it as much, I don't think. There are things in Space Marine that I would have preferred were explored more or explored slightly differently, perhaps. Yeah. Richard, yes, got all three of them and still have. Amazing. Still got the original copies that you bought. That's awesome. And then Christopher had a big impact on me, and now freelance for Black Library as an author. So Circle of Life, I guess. Oh, amazing, mate. That's cool. That's very cool. I mean, and this is the long tendrils of this early collection of fiction, right? Is that actually these books still have impact today? You know, stuff still goes back that references these. There are things that turn up in all of the different games the Games Workshop and other companies on license are creating, still tying back to a lot of this stuff. So even if it's not canonical in the sort of truest sense anymore, there's very clearly still nods and ideas and, you know, reflections, echoes, whatever you want to call it. These books are influential and still have an impact. Stoney, I remember it coming out but didn't read it until several years later. Richard, they were what I've been waiting for, as I remember. Yeah, I mean, that's very cool. Yeah, like I say, I can absolutely believe that. Jack Yeovil books were always your favourite, Johns. Yeah, I mean, the Yeovil books, I think, are, for me, something else. Like, they have skyrocketed. So since I started reading those for Book Club a couple of years ago, that has made Kim Newman into one of my favourite authors. So I just think his work is absolutely amazing. And I think that those books have absolutely stood the test of time. There are so many good moments, so many good ideas, so many good characters. Just brilliant, brilliant books. Lewis, I remember it coming out. I didn't buy it because it sounded, by its title, a bit generic. Little did I know. Which is ironic, right? It is. Because, like this, Space Marine, it is such an underwhelming title. Like, yes, it is exactly what it says on the tin. And which I guess was the intention. Let's write a book about Space Marines, and so we'll call it Space Marine. Whether or not that's a good idea when you've also got a game called Space Marine and your major component of your IP is Space Marines, I mean, I guess it made sense at the time from a business perspective, but it totally undersells what the book is about, because it's almost like, the book's very much about the brothers, the three brothers of Trazior Hive. So you could have called it Brotherhood or something. Similarly, that's not like that's particularly excited. But there's other things you could have called it that might have had more poetry to it, I suppose. Space Marine, it is quite generic. The book itself is not generic, though, as we now know, or as I now know. Advertised quite a lot, as you recall, and preferred it to Inquisitor. It's where it all started for me. Excellent, Swabilius. I take it you enjoyed it then on that first read. Anvil, I also like the Inquisitor novel somewhat more than this one, although also still only read the first of that series, but this one has its moments for sure. Aztec, I really enjoyed the Inquisitor War and now realise that I have not read Space Marine. Okay, well, I mean, it is worth a read. Like, regardless of anything else, regardless of any criticism, and I do have criticisms of it, I think it is definitely worth a read. It is so different to the sort of the modern 40k world, but there are things in here that you can clearly see are the sort of origins of certain things, which is kind of it's quite fascinating. It's kind of like reading in the truest sense, an ancient text of a world that, where the science wasn't understood in the same way, and the mythology was just different to how later people would interpret all of that stuff. So I do think it's really worth a read. And we've got Lewis in the chat here. For anybody who is unaware, although I'm sure most of you will know of it already, but Lewis does an amazing podcast called the Old Hammer Fiction Podcast, where he's reading through these sort of classic texts and does an amazing job, and essentially creating an audiobook version of some of these books that are hard to get hold of. I highly recommend it. Old Hammer Fiction Podcast, well worth taking a look, because he's done Space Marine, and he always does an amazing bit of analysis at the end of each section as well, which is well worth listening to, and has done loads of the other GW books. So definitely recommend it. And then Lewis, by 1993, Marines in second edition were getting a lot more clean cut, not like these guys. Yeah, absolutely right. And so I guess that's the sort of next place to go. So we have this really interesting stuff on Necromunda. We have the three brothers, three gangers who are far from brothers to start with. They get recruited into the Imperial Fists. Now, I'm not totally au fait with all of the sort of current lore around Space Marines and the creation of Space Marines. It doesn't feel like, to me, and my sort of not perfect knowledge, but I don't believe that like a 14-year-old ganger is recruited in quite the same way anymore. I might be wrong, but it felt like it was sort of a different type of recruitment process. I mean, they're literally going in and sort of having an interview, so it is very much like quite a different process. And they go in and they see this Marine who is so he's lost his legs and he's on tracks, and I think he's lost an arm as well, so he's got a cybernetic arm, and he's just like hard as nails. What I've and this was not intentional, but I've also been listening to the audiobook of Starship Troopers at the same time as reading this book, and sort of switching between the two, and it has been a fascinating comparison. Like I say, unintentional, just a coincidence that I was going through both at the same time. But Starship Troopers, and there's going to be a GW book club on that later on, so we'll get into that in detail then. But Starship Troopers, it's got similar scenes to these early sort of scenes of the recruitment and what it's like to go in and choose to become a Space Marine, essentially. And I thought that was quite fascinating to see where it overlaps. I'm going to assume Ian Watson would have read Heinlein's Starship Troopers, and so this is a direct like homage or sort of relationship with that. But yeah, there's something interesting there. Anvil, I didn't read it as them going in for an interview to become a Marine. I thought it was more about joining the local militia or PDF or maybe the Imperial Guard. But then it just so happens the Fist was there to scout for talent. No, you're quite right. I think you're probably right. It was more that they just happened to be appropriate for becoming Marines. And yeah, they probably weren't there because they thought that they would become Space Marines. But I still think it has that sort of... Even that isn't how I imagine like 10th edition Space Marines being selected. Like it kind of feels to me, and like I say, correct me if I'm wrong here, but modern Space Marines feel to me that they would be sort of taken at a much, much younger age and trained from much, much younger age, and kind of, they don't necessarily have quite so much choice in it. They wouldn't necessarily choose to be being recruited. As I say, I could be totally wrong about that. And I remember there's stuff about the recruits on Fenris, going out, and I think there was a Hammer and Bolter about it, where they go out and hunt wolves and stuff in order to prove themselves. So I could be mistaken. But it doesn't feel like they would be having a conversation and then being sort of selected in quite the same way. Anybody who knows different from that, do tell me. This played a lot more like a movie recruitment process. Like, you're watching a film, and it's very cinematic actually as a book. It could easily have been a movie in that sense. Did they get the chance to refuse the Fist? I don't remember if they did or not. Good question. It might be that there was a sort of, as implied, you are coming with us, or you're not going anywhere kind of thing. But it's the whole feel of the scene. So besides the particulars, the whole feel of the scene felt more kind of conversational and traditional for Recruitment than I would expect a Space Marine recruitment to be now. Just even the act of having a conversation, and a Space Marine coming into the room and sort of sizing someone up, it doesn't feel like that's how it would be done these days. And by these days, I mean in the modern 41st millennium, but there you go. So yeah, they are recruited into the Space Marines, and they have to go in and they have to go into training. And this is where it's very similar to Starship Troopers in that those first number of chapters are all about the sort of the day-to-day and the sort of struggle that as a recruit you have going in. There is this very early from this point on, there is the sense that they are going to have to get over their conflicts. These three guys, they've been in different gangs. Alexandro, in particular, having been super cruel with all of his buddies, there is the immediate sense that now that they're all training to become Space Marines, Imperial Fists, they are going to have to... They're basically going to have to put behind them all of that animosity, because now they're going to be brothers. And then this is going to be the sort of central theme for the book in a way, where it's going to be about these three together succeeding and then learning what it is to be a Marine and then exploring different aspects of being a Marine. And I think that that's a very strong pitch for a book. It's a great opening on Necromunda. It's all cool stuff when they get recruited. And then you're set up with the how are these three going to sort of go through being Marines? How are they going to make it through boot camp and through being scouts and so on? And how are they going to sort of come to terms with one another? And then you're also, we'll get to it, but they go off in different directions and they sort of explore these different components of Marine life. So I think that's really strong as a setup. But I don't think that the novel does enough with that, personally. Because you don't really get... Like they don't. It's not like... And maybe I wanted it to be more classic Hollywood movie, and I wanted the three of them to sort of team up and to be high-fiving by the end and saving each other's lives and sort of best friends. I wanted maybe a Top Gun kind of story where they start off as rivals and then they end up being best buds. You can be my battle brother anytime. That might be what I wanted, and it doesn't quite give you that. It kind of does some stuff with that. But because we don't, over the course of this book, really get into... Like, the characters are interesting, and there's some depth to them. Alexandro continues to struggle with being a jerk, basically. Just being a very selfish, entitled toff who doesn't like anybody, has a superiority complex. And at the same time, as he becomes a Space Marine, he goes into the sort of religious fervor, and the sort of he gets completely obsessed with pain, and there's the pain glove, which is a full body suit that just delivers pain through your nerve endings. So he becomes kind of obsessed with that and looks for this kind of this pain and religious ecstasy is what Alexandro's story becomes. But it doesn't go far enough for me. Like it starts walking down that line, but then it doesn't go all the way, I don't think. And the same goes for Biff and for Jeremy Valance, who don't quite... we get one of them sort of becomes more obsessed with the history of the Imperial Fists. So Biff, who was the sort of from the Underhive, the Undercity, becomes obsessed with the history and the traditions and the meaning of being an Imperial Fist. He goes and reads all the books, and he's had to go. He had to learn the language. He had to have sort of hypno training for the language because he didn't really speak the same language as the other two Necromundans. So he has to learn all of that. So he has a really interesting story where it becomes about... He becomes like a real traditionalist, which I think is quite... Like, that's interesting, and that doesn't quite go far enough for me. I don't think he doesn't necessarily like get into that as much as I thought he was going to, and he doesn't utilize it as much as I thought he was going to. And then Valance, he has a slightly different story. So he ends up becoming obsessed with Lexandro, and that's where, you know, the much talked about kind of homoerotic energy that is in this novel, like that's where that all kind of comes from. So there is but all three of those kind of those sort of different stories, those parallel explorations, I think they're all very interesting and really well set up and make perfect sense. But I don't feel like there was a satisfying conclusion or even a satisfying exploration for any one of those three things. And that, I think, is a bit disappointing to me. And that's probably where my biggest problems with the novel lie, is that, you know, when we get to the end of the novel, it's quite abrupt, and we don't really get to, like, they don't learn any of the lessons. They sort of start down these separate pathways, and then they don't really get to complete those journeys or necessarily learn much from them, I don't think. But that's me, and we'll come back to that at the end. I think I'm probably thinking too much of, like, you know, lots of different kinds of films and novels and books and TV shows as well, of the rivals who sign up and they discover their own hidden talents, and they all sort of evolve in parallel into fully fledged whatevers, and then have to work together, drawing on the particular skills that they've learned that they specialized in. That's a very tropey kind of story, and this book sets itself up as being that, and then doesn't go into all of those tropes. It doesn't fully deliver on all of those tropes. And whilst that could be good, you know, you could be like, that's quite unique, it's quite exciting, there's some quite sudden deaths in this book. It can also be less satisfying, I would say, myself. Lewis, I think the early Space Marines, they were easy come, easy go Marines. Indeed, whole chapters could get chewed up and spat out. So why be piggy about a Marine, because he'll be dead soon? Yes, I mean, this is a very good point, actually, right? And this is something that this book is a really good representation of, is the early Rogue Trader version of Space Marines, because they are just elite troops, but anybody almost can become a Space Marine. Meaning that you get mean Space Marines, and you get jerk Space Marines, and you get, like, you know, some might be nice guys, some are just doing 9 to 5. There's a much more sort of soldier, like traditional soldier sort of feel to these guys. And some of them are outlaw, sort of criminal scumbags and things like that. So they're not all noble battle brothers fully obsessed with the Emperor and doing the right thing and all whatever that might be. They're in the Rogue Trader version of Space Marines, in the very early version, they're much more just soldiers who have been recruited and given all of these powers. At least that's my sort of interpretation of them. So you don't, you know, this book, I think, is part of that journey to making them more into like Templars and Knights and, you know, and all of that sort of holy quest kind of stuff. I'm not saying this is the first and only place where that's taken place, but I think that this book does a lot to kind of, even if the sort of particulars of this book get shaved away over time, the vibe of Space Marines in this book is very much something that still exists today, and if not in its execution and its weirdness, very much in its sort of intent of Space Marines are holy orders of Templars who are out there in space doing good stuff, you know, good stuff for the Emperor and the Imperium. And you get loads of that in this book. I mean, and then that ultimately, and you know, a lot of people have said this, ultimately, the best thing about this book is just how utterly bizarre, how just proper weird Space Marines are. You know, and when you look at sort of, you know, the Horus Heresy and later Space Marines, they have their own, you know, there's plenty of interesting characters, there's plenty of amazing stories, but I've also sort of gone on record as saying that I think that later interpretations of Marines can often be a bit whiny and a bit self-centered and a bit just sort of, you know, they're a bit too simple in some ways. Here, they are just like, they're inexplicable. They're properly weird. Like, their traditions are strange because it's all rooted in these deep traditions and deep faith and things that don't really make sense. You know, lots of like really kind of like deep religious, like, you know, if you wanted to go into like deep Catholicism and that kind of stuff, and like ideas that have been like passed down for millennia, and no one quite understands why they existed in the first place, or what exactly they mean, or how they function, but they do them because this is what we do and this is important and it's sacred, and there's all of this ritual around it. There's so many things. I mean, we get like a lot of stuff about like scrimshoring, so like carving art into bone fragments and into like finger bones and things like that. And that is, it's given to, it's kind of it's positioned as this sort of hobby, I guess, this artistic kind of this like the way in which Imperial fists come to express themselves artistically, creatively, and it's something that they all do. Ultimately, it gets them all, and they all want to be doing it, and they've kind of got a hall of relics that have loads of them there. And it's such an interesting, specific detail that's very strange, but it adds quite a lot because of its innate strangeness, and it's also tied into like the way in which they obsess over the reliquaries, and you know, like Rogel Dawn, like his actual hand is an artifact of like mysticism and almost magical potency, and it is handled with this extreme reverence, you know, to the extent of worship, essentially. And that's because they're all properly weirdos, like fully indoctrinated into the cult, the Imperial cult, and fully committed to doing everything according to all of these strange traditions. And I think all of that's very, very good. Like, all of that's really, really interesting and well told. So yeah, very, very, very interesting stuff. And that definitely moves you away from the earliest version of Space Marines, where they might have just been like 9 to 5 kind of feeling, which I think you do get in some of that earlier Space Marine stuff. I guess that still would seem a bit off to me, just given how much of an investment each Marine is, though I suppose the Imperium has infinite resources, sort of. Yeah, it's interesting, Lewis, because I think, and that is just an inherent contradiction, I think, you're right. But then that's, again, this is from Rogue Trader, from the first book itself, and then, what is it, White Dwarf 90-something, 96, 97, 98, where they talk about the creation of Space Marines, and that's where you get all of this detail about all of the different organs that go into them, all of the different procedures that they have to go through, the surgeries, and a lot of stuff that kind of establishes, in a very role-playing game way, the limitations of their power set and the reasons that they have those powers. So, okay, they're really super tough, they can take this many bullets, and that's because they have a black carapace that's beneath the skin that is, like, super strong. And that also plugs into their power armor, and then that allows them to have this strength and this speed and so on. So there's quite, you know, and that's the very nature of that writing, is precisely to achieve that, right? It is to explain why they can do what they can do in the game. So all of that stuff is taken here and explored in further detail. Some of it quite, perhaps, excessive detail for me. In like, you know, Watson spends a lot of time talking about, like, Laraman's ear and how that works and what that allows you to do. And again, I mean, I guess this is all sort of, you know, Chekhov's organs, because he's going to set up a load of stuff, and that's going to explain how they are able to achieve certain stuff later on. But then there's also kind of this there's what Watson sort of enjoys getting them, like, back to basics. So there's multiple action scenes where the Marines are sort of unable to use any of their equipment, they are unable to use any of their armor, they're completely stripped naked, and they have to triumph purely on the basis of their own physicality and their own, you know, ability. Which I would say probably happens like too often in the same book. But yeah, I mean, again, this is just one of those sort of aspects of Watson's writing that I think is quite that, you know, I mean, that's innately just his work. I think because I did interview Ian Watson a little while ago for the channel, and he he just said that he liked to make things lurid. He just liked to get lurid things in there. And there was another quote as well that I think I've written down somewhere. I'm just going to double check it, because he's such an interesting character. Yes, he said I was being lurid, deliberately lurid, and then he went on to say that I hallucinated myself into a state of semi-madness before breakfast time, and then he would go on to talk about how he would make himself normal again after lunch so that he could then write the book based on the things that he's hallucinated so far. But yeah, that luridness, and maybe it's just like in keeping with fiction of the time, and certainly genre fiction of the time, and a certain style of writing. There's a certain sleaziness to it, I think. You know, and we see this. There's plenty of like ribald comments and kind of like unnecessarily, there's like toilet humor and sort of potty jokes and that kind of stuff. There's plenty of that floating around in this book. I personally could live without a lot of that. It doesn't add an awful lot for me. There's one point when I think it's Biff is at the back of the squad going through a tunnel, and Biff is described as being the arse flap. And then when he runs out of ammo, it's kind of like an empty arse or something like that. So there's there's lots of very poetic and really clever and interesting science fiction writing throughout this book. Really cool ideas. And there's the way in which he integrates sort of the organic and the technological is really interesting, and it's kind of grimy and dirty. It's kind of like Terry Gilliam sort of feel to stuff. That's really good. But then there's also like the potty humor, which I don't think is for me. It's not for me. It doesn't add enough for me. But I know some folks really like it, so I guess to each their own, I suppose. Just jumping back because I've gone off on all sorts of tangents there. Christopher, you were saying, I think the enduring friction and distance between the brothers is one of the reasons the story has real weight in places. I agree, and I think that absolutely, that kind of Hollywoodized version that I was kind of talking about, that's very simplistic. I think it can be a satisfying arc. I think you can also do that without making them best friends. And I guess that's what this book does. You do kind of get like certain aspects of that arc coming through. They don't ever become friends, but they do become brothers through their deeds. So yes, there is something there in that. I just didn't find their sort of conclusions to be as satisfying as I was hoping for. And Richard, there would be that distance after the earlier killings, and it's more realistic and less Hollywood. Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I guess I wanted them to overcome it in a more, and maybe this is just my limited sort of ability to intuit or interpret what I'm reading, but a lot of it goes unsaid, but it goes unsaid in such a way that I'm not convinced the characters even appreciate that it happened. So like Lexandro is very passive and kind of stoic. Well, stoic's not the quite right word, but like he's kind of just observing a lot of the stuff that happens, and he's observing it whether it is his battle brother falling in love with him, although he does get certain thoughts after that. But he's basically, this is happening. His battle brother has become obsessed with him and is talking about him all the time, but he just kind of doesn't react to it. And then later on, when his battle brothers have died, he also doesn't really react to that. He doesn't have a lot of like strong emotions, I guess I would say. And Lewis, I think the thing with their journey is that they are post-humans who have been driven insane by psycho-conditioning. So their reasoning, and therefore their character arcs, don't make sense to us. I think the dissatisfaction with the way they think and behave is alienating on purpose. And you're quite right. That is a huge part of what Watson is doing here. He is making them into this other. They're not humans. They're post-human. They sort of transhuman modifications, and they're sort of the what they're being asked to do, how they're being asked to do it, the way they've been changed. They are as alien as the Tyranids in a way. And I think that is really interesting. And I think that's potentially more interesting at times than certain other takes on Space Marines. But I also think, for me at least, within that truth, I still want a satisfying conclusion to a book. So I still want a story that has highs and lows, that has character drama, and that has sort of a beginning, mostly a beginning, a middle, and an end that I can make sense of. This book, with its, essentially with its alien leads, isn't as interested in telling a story in that way as I might be in reading a story that works that way. And that can be okay. That's not what Watson is sort of setting out to do, I don't think. But I also want to get to the end of it and feel like there was a story worth telling beyond the kind of fascination with the strangeness of Space Marines. So, I know I'm sort of speaking in riddles or sort of contradictions. I really like that the Space Marines are very alien and very strange. But I also want a story that makes use of that in a way that gets me to a satisfying conclusion. And that satisfying conclusion doesn't need to be that that all the Marines stand on the deck of a ship and explain their feelings to one another clearly. But it still has to sort of, if you're going to do noble sacrifices, I want to feel the power of that sacrifice. If you're going to be doing the suddenness of death and how just unfair it is and random and dangerous this universe is, I want that to mean something beyond a sort of shrug of the shoulders, I guess. And I when I say a shrug of the shoulders, I mean both Lexandro as a character kind of shrugging his shoulders. Yeah, I guess they're dead. But also the novel kind of shrugs its shoulders and says, yeah, I guess maybe this is the message of the book, but I guess I don't like it. The novel says, yeah, you've spent an entire book reading about these guys, but they're Space Marines, and this is a dangerous universe, and they're dead now, so, that's kind of the feel that I get at the end of the book, and sure, that's quite a clever, powerful thing to say about the 41st millennium, the grim, dark future where, all there is war. But also, that then leaves me reading a book where the character, they just die and that's it. So I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I wanted more. I did want more. Anvil. For me, it was really only Alexandro's suicidal or extremely reckless behaviour that struck me as not fitting in that sense, because it seems to me, not a military person, that it would be so unacceptable. I had a similar thought, actually. There's a couple of times, and yeah, you go on to say, for pretty much any military, because he also risks any of their plans, his colleagues, and their resources by his recklessness. I totally agree, and I found that quite frustrating, actually. And again, in comparison to Starship Troopers here, there are times when Alexandro does act emotionally, and that tends to be in battle, and that tends to take the form of ignoring authority and doing something really stupid that ultimately, in some cases, it works out, but in other cases, it only works out through luck, and he makes things significantly worse. So that was very odd that was completely unremarked upon in the book. It was almost a device to get the characters from one chamber where they were fighting squats to another chamber where they've been taken prisoner. And this happens a couple of times. And Alexandro is never dressed down for this. He's never reprimanded. He's never trained better. He never overcomes his impulsive behaviors. in Starship Troopers, you see characters doing things of this nature, and they're immediately brought to task because that's very much about a military precision, and they're training the best warriors in the galaxy, which Space Marines are supposed to be, and they have to behave that way or people die. And it's taken really, really seriously. Whilst in Space Marine, although these are training to be Space Marines, the greatest warriors in the universe, they get to do stupid things and then just get away with it, and then luckily survive and do it again. And I found that quite odd. And also, you know, whilst we talk about the realism of the relationship between the three main characters, you've then got like completely unrealistic things, like for instance the scale of Titans, and like 5 of them, 5 Marines can control an Emperor Titan, Imperator Titan, and they do so by like eating the brains of the guys who were driving it before. And it's literally one guy drives the legs, one guy's powering this gun, one guy's powering that gun, one guy's looking out the eyes. Like it's a very simplistic. That's really Hollywood. You know, that's the kind of thing. And forgive me, I'm about to get on a soapbox again. That's the kind of thing that really frustrates me in like a Star Trek movie, when you have a spaceship that has crew, like hundreds of crew, in order to work at this kind of optimal way most of the time. But then in certain scenes, when the drama requires, one person can do all of this ultra complex maneuvering and run the entire ship without any issues, just on their own. So if one person can run it in those kind of dangerous situations, and not just to ram into another ship, but to do really complicated maneuvering, then why have you got 150 other crew members? And that same thing kind of felt true here with the Titans, where these 5 Space Marines were able to just sort of take on this Titan and run the Titan. It just felt very, very Hollywood in a bad way. Like it was too simplistic. It didn't kind of work for me. Plus, also, it didn't feel very Space Marine-y to me. Like that's not. I don't imagine Space Marines going in, like taking over Titans and hijacking them and running around fighting other Titans. Like I kind of want more of their battle tactics. I want more of the ground level fighting, and I also want to see them being the best warriors in the universe. I want that to see their training and their tactics. I want to understand why these guys are so good at what they do, and like how they can do it without just getting lucky and sort of looking their way through. So you kind of like, I think there were some flaws in those kind of places as well. Lewis, with Watson's hallucinating, it's worth noting that none of the other authors from this era were willing to write stories about Marines. They saw them as being too restricted to be protagonists. Only he could find a way into them. Yeah, I mean, and that's a very fair point, you know, and you know, we know from like Jack Yeovil from Kim Newman was just not interested. Other authors just didn't want to. Not only did they not necessarily want to write for 40k, they didn't want to write about Space Marines. You know, the irony of that is incredible given where we are now. But yeah, I mean, as you say, Anvil, little did they know they could have got to run a 60+ book series by just having them shout "brother" and shooting some bolters. Sorry to Horus Heresy authors, I do like your work. I'm being facetious. Yeah. I mean, yes, and there's some very good stuff in those books, and there's interesting ways to write Marines, I think. But yeah, I think one of the interesting ways to write Marines is to make them weird, like Watson does. I just think some of Watson's excesses don't work for me, and some of the, you know, I almost would rather not have the action scenes where it's a bit sloppy. I'd rather maybe have the tighter kind of like stuff on the ship and in the train. If this book never saw them go into battle ever, I still think you could have written a really interesting book. So, like, I think there's the potential there for, like, if this was just about them training and just like all of the hell that they have to go through in order to become a Space Marine. Maybe they go on a scout mission and that's the end of the book, is they do their scout mission and get to become Space Marines at the very end, and it's that journey that I think would have been probably for me more interesting, because those were the best parts. And also that means you don't get some of the very 80s action movie scenes. So like when they go in and fight the squats, there's a lot of stuff where it's kind of a little bit silly or a little bit nonsensical, and some of that's in Lexandro's, like how he operates and just not following the rules and diving over stuff and just running off. Some of that's also in the way in which things play out, where they end up as the Marines end up getting captured in little cages, and the squats are like poking weapons through to slice their armor off piece by piece by piece until they're naked. And it's kind of funny in its silliness. And then as naked Marines, they're then captured, and then they become part of this ritual to summon a demon. So not all of that works for me. Anvil, I think the book has a segment where it just, in a few sentences, summarizes a number of campaigns that go on. That was great. Yeah, I mean, I also think that would have been fine. So if you see all of the stuff about how they become scouts and then what they have to go through as scouts, and that this is done off screen almost, that could work quite well. Titans as Megazords. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Lewis, as we saw in Inquisitor, Watson's plotting and story arcs are not his greatest strength. The recklessness did have a secondary purpose, Anvil, in the book, justifying Jeremy's obsession with protecting Lexandro, but I don't think that's good enough as a justification. No, you're right, and that is a part of the reason for that, and maybe that's Lexandro's reaction to, like, Jeremy's kind of obsession is to then push that further and to sort of distance himself through risking himself, which could be interesting. But again, I don't think enough comes from that kind of relationship anyway. So I'm not sure that we kind of get that stuff. Yeah, Lewis. Yes, I think the Horus Heresy series being dedicated to Ian Watson. Yeah, Dan Abnett dedicated it to him, didn't he? Which I think is great. And yeah, again, that does speak to the long shadow that this book does cast onto later 40k fiction and Space Marine related fiction. There's some, I'm being critical here because these are things that have sort of floated through my mind, but I did enjoy the book overall, and I do think it's got some great stuff in it, and I'm not surprised that it's still much loved despite being as sort of, over the top and unusual as it is in places. Richard, no one knew what an Imperator was then, though. No pictures until Titan Legions, only name mentioned earlier. Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. And that is a very good point. It's harder to, when these things are mentioned, it's kind of harder to imagine that they didn't exist properly yet. So, absolutely, there's going to be some jank in the execution of certain stuff. I can completely, that's a very fair point, and I'm probably being a bit facetious myself by calling it out. I guess maybe it's not the size that's the issue, maybe it's more just the kind of the plot device-ness of it. Of like, okay, so then they get into a robot and each one of them controls a different part of the robot and they use the robot to destroy other robots, kind of thing. That's your kind of like Arnie or Jean-Claude Van Damme movie kind of feel to it for me, and not always in the best way. But that's just a personal preference, really. Anvil, I think the book has a segment where it's just a few sentences. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I covered that one. But yeah, I think, the relationship between the three brothers of Trezior Hive, this is where I think for me, the biggest missing pieces lie. I wanted more out of their dynamic. And I think we get to a place quite quickly where they tolerate each other. And then following that, there's jibes and there's still some sort of back and forth. Because Lexandro just remains a jerk to the very end. But then you get Biff, who, because he's becoming sort of more into the kind of the nature of the Imperial Fists and the history of that of them as a chapter and all of their traditions. So that's quite interesting. And that's kind of put up against Lexandro's superiority complex, and because of his ecstasy through pain that he gets from the pain glove, he thinks that he's sort of become Rogaldorn's chosen Marine. And again, that's quite an interesting thing. But then neither of those things really amount to an awful lot. And then we also get, yes, the love interest, the love story, which isn't, I having heard that this existed in the novel, and this is kind of unfair on the book, I suppose, I came into it thinking that this was going to be much more significant, and that we would get more, like that sort of that homoerotic through line, the relationship between the Marines, the love story would be more present. And it is present. You do get Jeremy who becomes obsessed. You do get, so there's a moment when they're naked and they're being held hostage. Jeremy dives onto Alexandro in order to protect him. So they're sort of naked body to body, and then that then sort of, there's a few lines after that where Alexandro sort of thinks about it again, and it kind of comes back to him, and he kind of, he's musing on it. Maybe it awakened him in some way. So there is this thing there where there's the potential for more, but to me, it felt just kind of like it was raised. And I suppose this is something that happens across the book as a whole quite frequently. It raises interesting questions. It kind of says, oh, what about this? What about this aspect of the Marines? I mean, it mentions the fact that the sort of pain, the pleasure in pain aspect of Imperial Fists, like that's a thing that the chapter has dealt with, and that Alexandro's not unique in that necessarily. Some Imperial Fists can become obsessed with the pain glove, and like then it doesn't do anything with it. That's kind of like, well, that's quite Slaneshi. That could be quite interesting. What does that mean? But then it doesn't have any further sort of interest in exploring that. It just raises it as a question. So it raises this question of, does Jeremy actually love Alexandro? Like, is it more than just a kind of weird obsession with a former bully? Or, is it some sort of is it a true love, or is it something else? It kind of raises it, but it doesn't fully explore it, which can work and can be fine. I'm not, I don't need everything spelled out, and I don't need everything. Not every story has to be brought to a conclusion. But in a novel of this kind, what I'm not too keen on personally is too many different threads, too many different stories, too many different ideas just piling up as, here's something really interesting. Aren't you curious about it? And then it doesn't want to actually resolve it. Like it doesn't then go to the end and actually get to the conclusion of what it is. It just raises it and then walks away. So there's a few of those that I would have liked to see explored more, and it's a lot in the relationships. As much as it's a great foundation for the that trio as the foundation of the story, ultimately I don't think Watson's that interested in getting deeper into them and their sort of emotional connections. I think he gives us as much as he wants to, and then he sort of leaves it. So there's kind of stuff that's not as deeply explored as I want, I suppose. But then there's some really cool stuff in here. So you get there's loads of squats, and that's fun. Tzeentchian cultist squats is really cool. There are squats who are riding ambles that have cybernetic enhancements. Just wild, fun stuff. There is a Marine who has been who has had his arms and his legs amputated and has been left sort of concreted into the ground because he won't die. So it's just this like eternal punishment. This is like proper Grecian sort of punishment of the gods kind of stuff. Like that's all pretty cool. Excuse me. So, yeah, lots of interesting stuff. So, roller skating rebels with shuriken catapults. Yes. Absolutely, I forgot about those, Christopher. So when the Marines, I can't remember if they were scouts at the time, but they go into a mission, and this is before they get on the Titans, and the bad guys are like the dance troupe from Starlight Express. So they are roller skating warriors who are zipping around. It's very, very cool. It's so 80s. It's so absurd. It's so over the top. It really speaks to just that oddness of genre fiction of that era. I thought it was great. Yeah, I really liked that. Like wheelies from Return to Oz. Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you say, Richard, yeah, that's Rogue Trader as hell. It really is. Yeah, it's silly, but in a brilliant way. There's loads of that kind of thing, and yeah, it just being in the sort of in the 40k of this era, and just it all, it's all happening. There's oddities and like bizarre things, and the way in which the Space Marines wage war. I really like the we got the Imperial Fists fortress monastery, and just the scale of it. There's some really, I mean, there is some really nice stuff with that. The actual pain glove itself as like a weird device for punishment that the Imperial Fists have. So it's like a full body glove, a full body bag that you get into right up to your chin, and then it generates pain. Like that is quite interesting. Like those are weird. It feels like stuff that would be in, and I hate to keep coming back to movies, but it feels like stuff that would be in a Zardos or a Logan's Run or whatever. All of these kind of weird things, and they work really well, and they add quite a lot of stuff. Lewis, in the original Rogue Trader, an Inquisitor had a 1% chance of having a hoverboard. So every 100th Inquisitor enforced the Emperor's will whilst looking cool as hell. Absolutely, man. Yeah, exactly. A lot of this was a product of the fact that the Citadel range already included a load of guys on hoverboards, right, from the Judge Dredd range. So how can we make sure that they become a part of Rogue Trader? So this is why Rogue Trader is basically absorbing all of the different influences, all of the different things that are around at the time, because it has to make use of miniatures that were not created for 40k. Obviously, over time that changes. By the time you get to second edition, it's all pure 40k miniatures, pure 40k IP. This book is in that transitionary period where I guess you can just have weird stuff, and I think even in the Horus Heresy and other novels like that, you still get to hear about there was a world that we wiped out that had all of these completely weird dinosaur men on. You get that kind of cool stuff in passing. In here, it's not just in passing. You're getting scenes with these guys, and you're getting some quite cool stuff. I was going to mention as well, so the actual there's an because it seems like chaos is not going to be present in this book, but it is, and it's quite nicely done, I think. So there is this sort of dissenting, a rival emperor, and I wouldn't be surprised if this wasn't a direct Abnett influence as well. Like a big part of the story is that the Imperial Fists have to go and take out someone who's claiming to be the emperor, because they're creating their own sort of sub-empire, parallel empire within the Imperium. So they go to war, they take out all of these sort of rebels who believe themselves loyal to the Emperor, and that Emperor then flees and goes off to a planet full of squats. And then it's only when they follow him there, having destroyed the Titans, having reclaimed the world, they then fight their way through all of these squats, they get captured, and then he's about to perform a ritual. So the 3 Marines are going to become sacrifices for what he claims, and I really like this actually. So Sagramoso is the name of this rival emperor. He has managed to get all of the squats on board by claiming that he can bring their ancestors, their living ancestors, back to life, or he can get the dead ancestors, the long dead ancestors, and bring them back to life. And he does that by actually, he lifts up his cloak and his shirt, and underneath there are faces in his skin that are sort of trying to get out. Really creepy stuff. And then it only slowly becomes apparent that, well, actually what's happening here is that he's become corrupted by Tzeentch, but he doesn't even know this. So he does think that he's an emperor. He does think he's a god. He does think that he himself can connect to the ancestors of the squats, but it's actually Tzeentch that is sort of empowering him to do this. And through this ritual, he's not going to bring back ancestors. He's going to be summoning a load of horrors of Tzeentch. So that's very, very cool. And I think that I'm always a fan of seeing like Tzeentch and chaos generally and psychic powers explored in a way that really speaks to that goes beyond the sort of traditional tabletop side of things. I think what we tend to see is like a lot of the tabletop like chaos armies, because you have to explain them and categorize them and detail them very clearly, very plainly. A lot of it tends to be, here's a load of guys who are evil and they've pledged themselves to chaos, and now they're doing evil chaos stuff on the battlefield. But what you can get is these really interesting ideas of someone who is just selfish or vain or evil for some other reason without being chaotic, and chaos preys upon that, and it's temptation and it's corruption, and it's the proper tainting of individuals who are vulnerable to the ruinous powers because of other things they do. They don't just go out and decide to become chaos. They get seduced by chaos, whether they are conscious that is happening or not. You don't have to sign a contract. You don't have to meet a demon and shake hands with it in order to become a follower of chaos. You can accidentally find yourself there through the things that you do. And I think that is really cool and really well executed. And there's some really creepy stuff with that. As I say, the Marines all end up totally naked, and I'm not sure they necessarily needed to be for that particular scene, but you do get a lot of that throughout. And that's just one of those things. Ratty, I've always thought that though this is still the best Space Marine book to adapt into a movie, it's a boys becoming men tale with the general audience could follow among the 40k universe. 40k weirdness. And Richard, agree, a lot of it almost feels like lining up filming. Yes, so I completely agree. Even with the weirdness, even with the excess, even with what I believe is sort of some like unresolved plots, because this is such a simple tale of recruits becoming Space Marines, and it has that central dynamic with the three, I think absolutely this could be a really good setup for a film. Excuse me, I'm getting a bit of a cough developing. It has everything you need for a beginning, a middle, and an end in a true Hollywood fashion. There's a lot of opportunity. You don't have to have it doesn't have to be sappy. It doesn't have to be all sort of nice and neat, but there is enough here and enough interesting stuff. Even with the Sagramoso, the crusade and the different stages of that crusade. So initially they think they're doing this, then they have to go back because it turns out he escaped, and now he's aligned with chaos. All of that's really good for a film. I think that absolutely would make perfect sense for a film or for a TV show. If someone were to say to me, okay, Henry Cavill and the team at Amazon have decided to adapt Space Marine, Ian Watson's Space Marine, for their show, 100% completely behind it. I'd happily see it. I think an Inquisitor show would be great as well, like an Ian Watson Inquisitor show. You would obviously have to update certain stuff. You'd obviously have to smooth certain things out to make it more palatable and more appropriate and more in line with the modern world of 40k. But the bones of those stories, they work really well. I think they could absolutely be some great stuff. I think that there's a lot here that you could absolutely do a really good TV show with. Imagine a 10-episode show, and the first episode takes place during the gang war on Necromunda, and it ends with the three of them being recruited into the Imperial Imperial Fists. I think that would be an amazing first episode, and it would show you so much about the 40k universe in just an hour, and then it would open the door really, really interesting and intriguingly into the Space Marines. So I 100%. Like I say, I'm criticizing a lot of things in this book. There's a lot of things that I would love to have seen more of. Places I think it could have gone. Stories I think it could have finished more satisfactorily. But I think it's a great book overall. I enjoyed reading it, and even now with it so far out of date, you can still feel the 40k-ness of it. You can still feel how so many ideas flowed through this book and went on to be important later on. There are interesting perspectives on the squats, on the Space Marines, on the Imperial Fists. There's some really cool stuff to take away from it. There's a lot of good stuff. Christopher, the way that the Sacramoso, I think you're talking about, dies is a very memorable scene. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get one of the squats sort of running down, having realised that it's not quite right. And Lewis, you're saying, I like the way that some of the squats watch the stomach face thing and are like, wait, I'm not sure these are our ancestors, actually. Yeah, I think that completely. So you get that not all squats are in favour of this. They realise that this isn't quite right and it's not what they think. And one of them comes running down and frees one of the Space Marines. And there's actually a really good moment when the Space Marine, just almost like pumped up on adrenaline and fearing for his life, kills the squat who frees him almost on reflex, just takes him out because there is an alien, he doesn't care. So there's like a really interesting thing there. Like it shows, there's many things in this book that show the kind of mercilessness of Space Marines, but that moment is very, very good. And then you get throwing the axe and killing Sacramoso, putting an axe through his chest just as he's about to complete this sacrifice and this spell to summon forth a load of horrors. You also get the librarians come because they've been sort of honing in on the psychic energy, and that's also when you get Valance jumps onto Alexandro to protect him. So yeah, it is a good scene. How you get to that scene is there's some messiness, but there's some good stuff there. Lewis, I think the Warped Stars, the first Watson short story, would make a great first episode of a TV show. I can see that. I mean, I think there's a really relatable aspect to that story as well, where it's because that is going to try and find a potential powerful psyker who is on the cusp of being corrupted by chaos, which I think is great. I mean, I would imagine, as well as doing a sort of coherent kind of Space Marine-esque narrative for a main show, you can't tell me that there isn't a potential like X-Files but in 40k TV show. So you have an Inquisitor and their retinue, and they are just going around the universe, Mulder and Scully style, investigating weird stuff. And sometimes it turns out to be psychers, sometimes it turns out to be chaos, sometimes it turns out to be aliens, and sometimes you just have to fight them on a spaceship. Like those kind of things. I think there's a really interesting show, main characters who just go off and do lots of different weird and wonderful and amazing quests in the 41st millennium. And do we believe that the Cavill Amazon project is actually going to happen? Because I'm skeptical as all Maelstrom. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it, with things like this? I imagine the money involved is enormous. Like, to adapt anything like Space Marine, anything like a sort of satisfying 40k story is going to cost you an enormous amount of money. Just the special effects, but the writing as well, and just the creation of so much stuff. You need to be doing stuff on a Star Wars scale in terms of production, and then some, and Star Wars has got the benefit of there being things you can borrow. You can go off and use costumes, you can go off and use models or special effects or whatever from previous productions. This is all brand new. You've got to build the 40k universe from scratch for digital effects, for physical effects. You've got to write all of this stuff and do all of your world building in a show. I imagine it's a very tough challenge. I'm still hopeful, and I think with the way Warhammer has gone, in terms of its sort of broader appeal and its success over the last decade or more, it's ripe for adaptation. Whether, like, I think it will, I think some version of it will happen in the next, however many years, 5 years. Whether it turns out to be, something really good and like a really successful adaptation. I'm trying to think of a good example of a successful adaptation of this kind. There's not many. What we don't want is for it to turn out like a Warcraft movie, right? Where certain aspects of it visually work, but it's kind of an underbaked story and it's not that successful and it has no impact, despite the huge impact of the game on culture. And the impact of the movie was negligible. It's not memorable. People don't remember it. People don't point to that movie and say, wow, that was a watershed in fantasy filmmaking, in the same way they say about the game. So it's entirely possible that a 40k movie does happen and it goes the way of Warcraft, or even the recent Dungeons and Dragons movie, which I personally think is magnificent and perfectly captures the spirit of my Dungeons and Dragons games. So I thought it was amazing. I thought that was absolutely fantastic, and that was not successful either. So there's a lot of risks. I imagine it would be a very tough challenge. I don't envy them. Well, I do envy them in a way, because I imagine sitting down with a blank sheet of paper and going, what story are we going to tell in the 41st millennium, is very cool. But actually delivering it, I imagine, would be quite stressful. But yes, I do think it will happen in some form in like the next 5 years, but I don't know what form that will be. And Richard, you're saying that you think almost all of the Deathwing stories would make great episodes. I mean, I think there were some good stories in there. I don't think, for me personally, I don't think they would all work, but I can see what you mean. I always felt like Drakenfel's TV series would be the most logical GW live action thing. But fantasy's not the known setting. I would love to see Drakenfels. I think Drakenfels would absolutely work as a prestige TV show, but I also think it would work as a great movie as well. Like, I think there's absolutely a fantastic movie to tell using the Drakenfels story. I think that would be very, very good, actually. I can completely imagine that. So I mean, I know I've gone off topic, off track a little bit, but to bring it back in on Space Marine and to sort of wrap up things, I suppose. Like, I did overall enjoy the book. I think that there's some really great stuff. Looking at the back of this book, there's some quotes on here, and I'm going to read these out. The Daily Mail said that Ian Watson is the most exciting science fiction writer since H.G. Wells. The Financial Times says the brilliant ideas man of British science fiction. And the Times Literary Supplement said, for sheer inventiveness and intellectual brilliance, Ian Watson has already established a place in the front rank of contemporary writers. So, in a way, I can agree with all of these. I think that there's some really fantastic ideas, and there's some really great, like, prose in the book. There is some fantastic stuff. And I enjoyed it. I think it was fun. I think it was appropriately silly at times. But there are things missing for me personally where, like, I wanted to see more of the things that are set up in the early and the sort of mid chapters of the book. I wanted that to continue on and to really deliver, like, to have the kind of, to have a bit more power, to have a bit more follow through, I suppose. So it was not a perfect novel for me. And yes, it was out there, and yes, it was wild. And yes, there is a lot of, like, toilet humor and some stuff that's, like, kind of questionable and unnecessary. You hear a lot of talk about these books as being, like, really wild and being, like, kind of like dangerous literature in a way. I don't think that's really the case. I think, yes, there's some stuff you can roll your eyes at occasionally. But I do think that there's a lot to enjoy in it. I'm still very much looking forward to continuing the Inquisitor series, seeing where we go with Harlequin, because I agree. He is Ian Watson is a brilliant ideas man. Like, there is some really fantastic ideas. There are some really creative ways of looking at the 40k universe and trying to make it into a place you can tell stories. I just think ultimately, like, Watson wasn't too concerned with telling a full story here. Like, I don't know, maybe it just needed another pass. The tale that Watson tells is that he submitted his draft of this book before things went to pot, and there was a load of edits expected by GW Books, by the editorial team at GW Books. So I guess David Pringle and Neil Jones. Then GW Books was disbanded. Then Box Tree picked up the license, and they wanted to proceed with publishing the book that he had submitted, but he never did any of the edits that were requested. So this is the earlier draft. Now, what the nature of those edits were, I've got no idea at all. I could absolutely believe that the editorial team would have wanted, like, let's clean up some of this language, and there's certain things that we just don't need, a few excesses that can be reined in a bit. Maybe there could have been some editorial comments about the structure of a plot and get an ending for some of that, for some more of these things. I don't know. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part. We'll never know. But yeah, there are things that I think another editorial pass on this book, and maybe a little bit of tweaking and polishing, could have made it better in a way that would stand the test of time even more than just the raw ideas. I don't know if I'm being fair. I don't know if I'm putting my own personal tastes on it too much. It is an object of its time. It is an object of ambition for Games Workshop in a certain era, and the sort of excesses of that era, whether that is in genre fiction or in Ian Watson himself, or just being able to get away with stuff that you probably couldn't get away with now. So, yeah, it's of its time. It's also not of most of its contemporary stuff, because Ian Watson's pushed the envelope pretty far in places. But I enjoyed reading it overall, and I think it does a good job of making Marines into weirdos. I would like more of that. I still want satisfying stories, but I would like more of Space Marines are weird. Like that's what I think I would go for as well. So there you go. That's my 2 cents on Ian Watson's Space Marine. Ill, as you say, the least questionable Daily Mail quote ever, 100%. And there's a bit of chat here about whether or not a Vampire Genevieve series would be a good sell. Yes, absolutely. Count me in. Very much would be a fan of that. Lewis, I suppose the difference is that the Black Library has been more successful in a New York Times bestseller list way than anything put out by D&D. Warhammer does have more narrative chops. Yeah, that's fair, but I do think, and yes, you're right, I think, on the numbers. There have been very successful New York Times bestseller, like Forgotten Realms novels and stuff as well, though, right? The Drizzt, like the Dark Elf novels, the Drow novels. I believe that they've done quite well, and they've been bestsellers. I think the Dragonlance novels have been very successful as well. So that it's not like D&D doesn't also have best-selling novels. But I get your point in the sort of broader, more current, modern marketplace. Richard, Detlef's greatest accomplishment to get onto the silver screen. That would be worth watching. Yeah, I mean, that would be great. And actually, you know what? I kind of want to go away and do a little fan casting now for who would I put in the Detlef role? I'm going to think about it. I'm going to have to think about it. He's maybe a little bit too old now, but like a Paul Giamatti could have been very good. But yeah. John, interested to see how I find Chaos Child. From what I remember, it was a scattered fever dream by the end. Yeah, I hear that it's the wildest of the bunch. I'm looking forward to Harlequin, I think. Like that that feels like it's going to be quite good fun. Chaos Child, I know the least about, and I can fully expect, based on the direction of travel with these books, I can fully expect it to get even further beyond any sort of bounds of good taste or reason or like appropriateness. So I'm very excited to see where it does go. Detlef played by Kenneth Branagh. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's certain poetic casting there. Anvil, a Drachenfels adaptation would be fun, but can the world survive so much meta in one place? Very good question, and probably not. No, I don't. I think this world has got enough meta already. If I'm being totally honest. Okay, folks, I have enjoyed, as ever, I've enjoyed getting to chat with you all about these books. I used to do like book club live streams more frequently. I'm planning to do more of these. It's just a good excuse to get together to chat about a book. I apologize, I've not gotten too deep into all the different aspects of stuff, and I also apologize for the technical limitations. I'm going to take better notes, I think, for my future. For the remaining books. Next up, it will be easy for me to do so because it's Route 666 by Jack Yeovil, one of my absolute favourite authors now. So I'm very much looking forward to that. It's a dark future novel. That live stream will be coming up next month. I will set up the live stream so you can see what date that is. In fact, let me double check it right now so I can tell you what the date will be. Because it's in the calendar. I think we should be on. So it should, I think, be on the 22nd of March. If anything changes, you'll be able to see on the channel when it turns up. But yeah, 22nd of March should be when I do Route 666. The Dark Future book. Very much looking forward to that. And again, it's just going to be a chance to get together, chat for an hour or so, and talk about the cool things in that book. And really get into it. So, yeah, I hope that you can join me for that one as well. Thank you for all of your comments. Thank you for all the discussion. Some really interesting points, some interesting suggestions. Very much appreciated. I can see some further casting decisions taking place for... could we have Matt Berry as Detlef Serk? I would like that very much. That would be great. Yeah, I think that could be really, really good. But yes, I really enjoyed that as ever. So thank you once again for joining me. Thank you for sharing in the chat. I will see you. There's plenty of videos between now and then, so do check out the channel. There's interviews coming as well on the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel. But yeah, another GW Book Club live stream coming in March, talking Dark Future. So until then, I will see you all later. So thank you so much.